February 27, 1943, Neustadt, Germany. The order didn't come with shouting, no blows, no insults. It came as a whisper. Anna Feldman had been standing in line for over an hour, barefoot, her feet sunk deep into the frozen mud of the main yard. That kind of mud that never really dried, because the winter sun barely touched the ground between the gray barracks. The north wind cut straight through her dress, too thin for this cold. When she arrived at the camp 3 months earlier, it had been light blue. Now it had the dark, soaked color of wet earth. No one spoke. No one cried. In a place like this, learning to stay silent was the first rule of staying alive. The second was never asking questions. The third, the most important one, was never, ever looking the guards in the eyes. There were 42 women in line, all young, all Jewish. They'd been selected the night before, during roll call, when the Oberaufseherin, the chief supervisor, moved slowly between the rows with a flashlight and a typed list. She didn't explain why. She just pointed. You, you, you. Until she reached 42 names. Anna was number 37. That was when Miriam Keller passed beside her. She tilted her head just slightly, avoided looking at anyone, didn't visibly move her lips, and still let 3 words slip out, so quiet they almost blended into the wind whistling between the buildings. Close your eyes and don't scream. Anna didn't understand. At first she thought it was a prayer, or just another warning, like all the others she'd heard since arriving. Don't drink from the tap in Block 5, it's contaminated. Don't look at Dr. Hartwig during inspections. It annoys him. Don't go near the fences at dawn. The guards shoot for fun. Warnings passed from mouth to mouth in whispers, an invisible survival network. But when the metallic sound of the medical barrack door shattered the silence of the yard, she understood. Ahead of them, one by one, the women disappeared into that low building of wood and brick. Everyone knew the building. No one talked about it out loud. They didn't come out screaming. They didn't come out running. They simply didn't come out. At least not through the front door. Some returned hours later through a side entrance, walking like sleepwalkers, eyes empty, hands pressed tight against their bellies. Others never came back at all. Only silence remained, and that silence weighed more than any scream ever could. The rumor had been spreading since dawn, jumping from bunk to bunk during breakfast, a piece of black bread and a brown liquid they called coffee. The doctor had requested young women, not to heal them, not to help them, to examine them. The word examine sounded like a sentence. No one knew exactly what it meant in that place, but everyone sensed that nothing good could be hiding behind it. The women who'd gone before never spoke about it. If someone mentioned the medical barrack, they stared into nothing. Anna dug her nails into her palms until it hurt. In front of her stood Eva Lorenz, 14 years old, too young to fully grasp what that word meant. Eva didn't ask anything. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground, silently counting the stones sticking out of the dirt, as if the numbers might slow time down. Her mother had been a Polish Catholic, an elementary school teacher in Krakow. Her father was Jewish, owned a small bookstore near the main square. That mix had condemned her twice. For the Nazis, she wasn't Aryan enough, and she wasn't Jewish enough to disappear quietly. To them, she was the worst of both worlds, a genetic problem that needed to be erased. The watchtower clock read 8:15 a.m. The sky was still gray, heavy with clouds threatening snow. The temperature hovered around 2 degrees below zero. The women trembled in line, but not just from the cold. They were used to the cold. They trembled because of what was coming. Then he appeared. Dr. Reinhardt crossed the yard with measured steps, every footfall calculated, every movement deliberate. A black notebook pressed tight under his left arm. He didn't seem rushed, and he didn't seem to enjoy cruelty either. What he radiated was correctness, almost too much of it. His boots shone despite the mud, freshly polished that very morning by a prisoner assigned to the officer's domestic service. His medical uniform was flawless, not a wrinkle, not a single visible stain. He was 46 years old. Before the war, he had worked as a forensic pathologist at Berlin's Charité Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical centers in Europe. Between 1935 and 1941, he published 17 articles in German medical journals and lectured in Vienna, Munich, and Prague. A member of the German Society of Pathology, a respected man, a recognized professional. Now he ran the reproductive experimentation department in Neustadt, under the direct supervision of Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, who had personally authorized the experimental protocols in a signed order dated July 7, 1942. His eyes moved along the line without settling on any face. He wasn't looking for people. He was looking for samples. He calculated approximate age, body type, visible health, about 2 seconds per woman. Medical efficiency applied to selection. His boots stopped in front of Anna. For the first time, he examined her, not her eyes, but her body, the way a veterinarian might assess livestock before a procedure. "The next one," he said. Neutral voice. No emotion at all. Miriam didn't look at her. Eva didn't move. And in that exact moment, Anna understood the warning. It wasn't run or fight. It was close your eyes. Because seeing what came next could break you forever. Because some images burned themselves into memory so deeply that not even time could erase them. And don't scream. Because no one there was coming to save you. Screaming only sped up the end. It only marked you as unstable, as defective material. Between January 1942 and April 1945, more than 74 medical experiments were officially authorized in German concentration camps by the Reich Ministry of the Interior and the Central Security Office. Neustadt, the only camp designed exclusively for women, held between 35 and 40,000 prisoners at its peak during the winter of 1943. Of those, at least 863 were subjected to surgical procedures without consent. Forced sterilizations, bone transplants, infections deliberately induced with gas gangrene bacteria and sulfonamides, pain resistance studies, and tests of permanent contraceptive methods using radiation or chemical substances injected directly into the fallopian tubes. The doctors involved were not movie villains, not deranged monsters. They were licensed professionals, trained at prestigious universities. They signed reports, kept meticulous records in leather-bound notebooks, photographed results with Leica cameras provided by the department, published preliminary conclusions in internal Reich medical journals. The horror didn't come from madness. It came from bureaucratic logic applied to human bodies turned into numbers, from industrial efficiency transplanted into medicine. Dr. Fritz Fischer, an orthopedic surgeon, performed bone transplants between living prisoners to study rejection. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, deliberately infected wounds with lethal bacteria to test new antibiotics. Dr. Karl Klauberg, a world-renowned gynecologist, injected experimental chemical substances into the uteruses of conscious women without anesthesia to cause irreversible sterilization in under 10 minutes. Dr. Wilhelm Arendt focused on studying the effects of radiation. The Nazi medical system operated on a simple, legally established premise. Certain groups of humans could be used as research material because they had already been stripped of legal personhood under the Nuremberg laws of 1935. These were not considered crimes. They were authorized experiments funded through budgets approved by the Ministry of Finance. The doctors received specific funding for equipment. The results were filed away in classified folders, and deaths were recorded as foreseeable complications within statistical parameters considered normal. Everything was documented. Everything was authorized. And everything was, under German law at the time, perfectly legal. Anna Feldman had been born in Breslau, today Wrocław, Poland, 20 years earlier, into a Jewish family of merchants who sold imported fabrics from France and Belgium. Her father, Isaac Feldman, had inherited the business from his own father. The shop stood on Schweidnitzer Strasse, one of the city's main commercial arteries. They sold silks, linens, velvets, wedding fabrics, curtains, and theatrical costumes. It was a solid business, a stable life. Anna was the youngest of 3 sisters. She had completed 2 years of accounting at a private academy until the racial laws of 1938 shut all educational institutions to Jews. She was introspective by nature, more observer than talker. She read constantly, especially Russian novels, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov. She was drawn to how those writers showed human complexity without judging it. She didn't cry easily. From childhood, she had learned that showing emotion didn't change facts. It only made situations harder to endure. When she was arrested in November 1942, during a nighttime raid in the Jewish ghetto of Breslau, she didn't ask why. She knew questions didn't bring useful answers. She packed what little she was allowed, a change of clothes, a brush, nothing more, and climbed into the cattle car without saying goodbye. Her parents had been deported 6 months earlier, in May. She didn't know where. Krakow, perhaps, or farther east. She never saw them again. Her 2 older sisters had managed to escape to Switzerland in 1939 before the borders closed. At least that's what she'd been told. She had no way to verify it. The journey to Neustadt lasted 3 days. 120 women crammed into a wagon built for 40. No toilets, no water, no windows. When they arrived, 17 were dead. They were dragged from the train like parcels. The survivors were shaved, disinfected with a liquid that burned the skin, marked with a yellow triangle sewn onto their dresses, and assigned to Block 17, the barrack for Jewish prisoners not yet sent to forced labor. Miriam Keller was different. She was 31 years old and had arrived in Neustadt in August 1942 from Lublin, where she had worked as a nurse at the municipal public hospital before the German occupation in September 1939. She was practical, direct, hard as cold steel. She had seen too many people die to believe in miracles or institutional mercy. During the first year of occupation, she worked in the Lublin ghetto treating typhus, tuberculosis, and severe malnutrition. She watched elderly people, children, pregnant women die, day after day, slowly, without medicine, without enough food, without hope. She didn't dramatize. She didn't comfort with empty phrases. She reported. That coldness wasn't cruelty. It was functional survival. She had learned that compassion without resources was useless, and that false promises could be more cruel than harsh truth. When she arrived at the camp, she stopped using her full name and kept only Miriam. Surnames in Neustadt were dangerous. They revealed origin, religion, family ties. She had learned to erase those traces, to become a shadow with no verifiable past. She had been in the camp for 6 months when she met Anna. 6 months watching trains arrive, watching women die, learning the invisible rules that separated those who survived from those who didn't. And one of those rules was simple. If you were called to the medical barrack, you had to assume you would not come back the same person. Eva Lorenz barely spoke. Not because she was shy by nature, but because she had learned that silence was safer than any word. Her Polish mother, Katarzyna Lorenz, had tried to protect her for more than a year, moving her from one hiding place to another. First, it was a Benedictine convent on the outskirts of Krakow, then the house of a distant cousin in a rural village, later the basement of one of her mother's former students. No refuge ever lasted longer than 3 to 5 months. Not before someone grew suspicious, or the danger became impossible to ignore. In January 1943, an anonymous tip, most likely from a neighbor who had noticed Eva's resemblance to her Jewish father, put an end to that fragile protection. The Gestapo arrived after midnight. They arrested Eva, her mother, and the family hiding them. They were separated on the train. Eva never learned whether her mother reached any destination alive. She never would. Now she was alone in Neustadt, too young to fully grasp the system, but lucid enough to understand one thing clearly: obey without question. Asking questions marked you as trouble. Her strength wasn't in words. It was in her fixed gaze, in her ability not to collapse outwardly, in keeping her back straight even when everything inside her was shaking. The medical barrack door opened again. A guard stepped out. Aufseherin Müller, 27 years old, former textile worker from a factory in Saxony. She had joined the female SS in 1941 because it paid better than any civilian job. She carried a wooden clipboard. She called out 3 numbers. Not names, numbers. The numbers tattooed on each prisoner's forearm: 67432, 67101, 67519. Anna was 67501. Miriam didn't look at her when Anna took the first step forward. Eva didn't either. But both understood the same thing in that instant. If Anna went inside, she might not come back, or she might return changed, broken in a way that didn't show on the outside, but altered everything. Anna walked the 17 meters between the line and the barrack door. She counted each step silently. 1, 2, 3. As if counting could give her control over something, anything at all. Inside, the medical barrack smelled of phenolic disinfectant mixed with something else. Something metallic and sweet at the same time. Old blood blended with iodine and ether. The walls were bare wood, unpainted, damp stains creeping into the corners. In the center of the main room stood a steel table covered with a sheet that had once been white, now marked with yellowish stains that would never come out. To one side, on a metal tray, lay surgical instruments, scissors of various sizes, scalpels with wooden handles, forceps, glass syringes, hypodermic needles soaking in alcohol. Everything arranged, everything clean. As if these were ordinary tools in an ordinary hospital for ordinary procedures. Dr. Arendt stood by the window, writing in his notebook in small, precise handwriting. He didn't look up when Anna entered. He simply gestured toward the table with his left hand. A casual movement. The kind you'd use to point to a chair during a routine medical appointment. Remove your clothes. Lie on your back. There were no curtains, no screens, no privacy of any kind. Gefreiter Paul Brandner, a 22-year-old German soldier assigned as a medical assistant, stood in a corner beside a metal cabinet, holding a box of bandages. He avoided eye contact. He always did, not out of kindness. Looking directly at the prisoners meant recognizing them as people, with faces, histories, names, and that recognition made orders harder to follow. It was easier to think of them as numbers, as clinical cases, as working material. Brandner had been drafted in 1941 and sent to the Eastern Front for 8 months. He'd been wounded in the right shoulder by shrapnel during a Soviet bombardment near Smolensk. That injury saved his life. He was reassigned to medical duties in the rear, first in a field hospital, then here. He thought it would be better. He thought he wouldn't have to see death anymore. He was wrong. Here, death came more slowly, and it came with signed forms. Anna obeyed. She had no choice. She slipped out of the worn dress with fingers that barely trembled and lay back on the cold steel table. The contact stole her breath for a second, like plunging suddenly into icy water. She closed her eyes. She remembered Miriam's warning. Close your eyes. She clung to it like a lifeline. Dr. Arendt approached without hurry. He set his notebook down on a wooden chair and washed his hands at a small sink for exactly 30 seconds. He had read studies on cross-contamination. He followed protocols even here. He pulled on white rubber gloves and checked the instruments one by one, making sure everything was in place. Every movement was mechanical, repeated hundreds of times, polished by routine. This procedure is part of a study on the feasibility of mass sterilization through controlled X-ray radiation, he said in a professional tone, as if delivering a lecture in a university hall. The objective is to determine the minimum effective dose capable of destroying ovarian function without causing visible external damage that would require further medical treatment. You are sample number 43 in Protocol B7. The procedure was approved by Reichsfuhrer Himmler under Order RFD 42, dated July 7, 1942. Anna didn't answer. She didn't ask anything. She kept her eyes closed and clenched her teeth so hard her jaw began to ache. Then something unexpected happened. A pause. Dr. Arendt hadn't touched any instrument yet. He hadn't turned on the equipment. He was standing still, less than half a meter from the table. Anna couldn't see him, but she felt his presence. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. 20. She could hear her own breathing. The tick of a wall clock somewhere in the room. The wind outside. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Lower. Almost careful. A tone he hadn't used before. If you experience extreme pain during the radiation procedure, do not scream. Screaming triggers involuntary vascular responses that increase internal bleeding and soft tissue inflammation. Close your eyes and breathe slowly and deeply through your nose. That will reduce long-term damage and allow for faster recovery. Anna opened her eyes slowly. She looked at him for the first time since entering. Dr. Arendt wasn't looking at her. He was watching the instrument tray, adjusting the position of a clamp that had already been perfectly aligned. His expression remained neutral, professional, like an engineer explaining how a machine worked. And yet, he had said something that wasn't written in any official protocol. It wasn't compassion. It wasn't an attempt to save her. It was a technical warning, an instruction designed to reduce visible suffering, minimize uncontrollable variables, and improve data quality. It wasn't kindness. It was experimental control. Dr. Arendt moved to the corner of the room where the radiation unit stood. A Siemens Stabile, model 1938. Originally designed for oncology treatments in civilian hospitals, requisitioned by him personally in Berlin in September 1942. He adjusted the dials with millimetric precision. Voltage, 180 kV. Exposure time, 12 minutes. Distance from tube to skin, 30 centimeters. Focus area, lower pelvic region. Everything was written down in the notebook before he began. "Do not move," he said. He positioned the metal arm of the machine over Anna's abdomen. The X-ray tube hovered in place, suspended at exactly the calculated distance. "Chutira." He checked the position twice more. Then he walked to the control panel on the opposite wall, behind a lead screen that shielded him from the radiation. "Beginning exposure," he announced out loud, for the record. From the corner, Brandner wrote the time on a loose sheet of paper. 8:27 a.m. The machine began to hum, low even, steady. There was no immediate pain, no clear physical sensation at first, just that constant sound, like an electric motor running in another room. Anna closed her eyes, breathed through her nose, started counting silently. 1, 2, 3, 4. After 2 minutes, she felt warmth, not on the skin, deeper, as if something at the center of her body were slowly heating up. At 5 minutes, the warmth turned into burning. At 8, the burning became pain. A dull, deep pain, unlike anything she had ever felt. Not sharp like a cut, not superficial like a burn. It came from somewhere inside, diffuse, impossible to locate, as if something within her was being destroyed cell by cell. She wanted to scream. Every muscle begged her to scream, to move, to escape. But she remembered the warning. Don't scream. She clenched her teeth, curled her fists, and kept breathing through her nose, slow, deep, as if that breathing could build a wall against the pain. At 11 minutes, it was almost unbearable. Nausea surged. Her body felt pierced by invisible needles. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but she didn't scream. At exactly 12 minutes, the hum stopped. "Procedure completed," Dr. Arendt said from behind the screen. Brandner wrote 8:39, total duration, 12 minutes. Dr. Arendt stepped out from the shielding, removed his gloves, and wrote in his notebook, "Exposure time, 12 minutes. Visible reaction during procedure, minimal. Silent tearing only. Sample stable. No physical restraint required. Excellent cooperation. Expected physiological results in 3 to 5 days. Follow-up required in 14 days. You may dress," he said without looking at her, focused on his notes. "Report again in 14 days for post-procedure evaluation. Number 67 Mavazonundadu 1 will be called during morning roll." Anna sat up slowly. Her legs shook so badly she thought they might give out. She gripped the edge of the table for a moment. The pain was still there. Deep. Constant. She put on her dress with clumsy fingers. Every movement demanded enormous effort. Gefreiter Brandner opened the door without a word, without looking at her. Anna stepped out into the yard. Daylight blinded her for a moment. The contrast between the dark interior of the barrack and the gray brightness outside was too much. She blinked several times. Miriam was still in line now, 4 places closer to the door. She looked at Anna and said nothing. She didn't need to. Anna saw it in her eyes. Miriam knew exactly what had just happened. She had seen it before, many times. Ava was gone from the line. She was already inside. Anna walked back toward Block 17. Every step was a fight. She wanted to run, to hide, to cry until there was nothing left inside her. But she kept moving upright, stiff, mechanical, as if that rigidity might keep her from falling apart. In the days that followed, the real effects began. The abdominal pain intensified. It wasn't constant. It came in waves. Sometimes it vanished for hours, and she thought maybe the worst was over. Then it came back stronger, like an internal stab. Nausea, vomiting, low-grade fever that rose and fell without a clear pattern. But the worst part wasn't her body. It was the certainty that something inside her had been altered forever, something essential, something that time and treatment could never restore, something that defined her as a woman, as a human being capable of creating life, had been deliberately destroyed by a man with a university degree and white rubber gloves. Miriam explained it to her one night, speaking very softly as they shared a piece of stale bread in the barrack. The wooden bunks creaked with every movement. Outside, searchlights swept the yard at regular intervals. Inside, there was only darkness and whispers. "What they did to you isn't new," Miriam said in her practical, stripped-down tone. "They've been testing mass sterilization methods for over a year now. Radiation, chemicals, surgery. They're looking for something fast and cheap, something that can be applied to millions of people. Jews, Roma, Slavs, any group they label genetically inferior." She paused, then went on. "The goal isn't to kill them right away. It's to stop them from reproducing, to make them disappear within a single generation without having to build more gas chambers. It's cleaner, more efficient, less politically complicated." Anna listened in silence. She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly. "Why did he warn me?" she asked at last, her voice barely audible. "The doctor. He told me not to scream. He even explained why." Miriam looked at her with those hard, exhausted eyes that had seen too much. "Because he doesn't care about you as a person," she said. "He cares about the experiment, about the data. If you scream, the body reacts unpredictably. Muscles tense, the heart speeds up, blood vessels dilate. That ruins the results, introduces variables he can't control." She lowered her voice even more. "He gave you that instruction so the procedure would be cleaner, more controlled, more scientifically valid. It wasn't compassion. It was experimental method. You're a lab mouse that can understand verbal instructions, and that improves the quality of the experiment." Anna understood then. Completely. The warning hadn't been a hidden moment of humanity, not a flicker of moral weakness in a cruel man. It had been part of the protocol, just another variable inside the experiment. Dr. Arendt didn't see people in front of him. He saw biological samples with specific traits, and those samples had to behave in predictable, controllable ways for the results to be scientifically valid and publishable. Eva Lorenz didn't return to the barrack that night. She didn't appear the next morning either. She came back 2 days later. She walked like an old woman, despite being 14. Pale, hollow-eyed, her eye sockets seeming too large for her face. She didn't talk about what had been done to her, but her gaze had changed in a fundamental, irreversible way. It was no longer the look of a child who still carried hope. It was the look of someone who had seen the exact limit of what a human being can endure, and crossed it without dying, but without remaining fully alive. She sat on her bunk without a word. Miriam handed her a piece of her bread ration. Eva took it, but didn't eat it. She held it in her hands for hours, staring at it as if she no longer remembered what it was for. Between February and April 1943, Dr. Arendt carried out 117 experimental radiation procedures on prisoners in Neustadt under Protocol B7. 93 survived the initial procedure without immediate complications requiring hospitalization. 42 developed severe complications in the following weeks: massive internal bleeding, generalized infections, pelvic tissue necrosis, intestinal perforations caused by tissue damage. 19 died within less than 3 months. None of those deaths were recorded as the result of medical experimentation. They were logged as cardiac arrest, generalized infection of unknown origin, or abdominal complications. The results were presented in a 52-page typed report titled Comparative Study on the Viability of Radiation Sterilization in Target Populations. Protocol B7, Preliminary Results. The document concluded that the method was technically effective in destroying female reproductive function, but required dosage adjustments to reduce premature mortality to levels considered acceptable for mass application. The final recommendation suggested reducing exposure time to 8 minutes and slightly increasing the tube distance to 40 centimeters. According to those calculations, mortality would drop from roughly 16% to about 8%, a figure considered acceptable for industrial-scale implementation. The purpose was never to save lives. It was to refine demographic elimination through applied science. The report was sent to Berlin in June 1943. It was read by Dr. Leonardo Conti, head of the Reich Office of Public Health, along with several officials from the Ministry of the Interior. After that, it was archived under secret classification. Copies circulated through other concentration camps running similar experiments: Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald. Anna survived. Her body tolerated the radiation better than many others. She didn't develop massive internal bleeding or fatal infections, but the damage was final. Her reproductive system was completely destroyed. The ovaries ceased to function. Internal tissue necrosed. She never menstruated again. She would never have children. At 20 years old, her body had been turned into a sterile organism through 12 minutes of controlled radiation. Miriam survived as well, though she was subjected to 3 more procedures before the war ended. First, another radiation protocol in May 1943. Then a chemical injection experiment in September. Finally, a surgical intervention in January 1944. Each one left its mark. Each one took away another part of what had once been a functional body. Eva was transferred to another camp in July 1943. Anna never knew which one for certain. Some said Auschwitz-Birkenau, others Bergen-Belsen. The official records only stated, transferred. Eva was never located after the war. Her name appears on lists of unconfirmed victims. She was 14 years old when she vanished from Neustadt's registration system. Dr. Wilhelm Arendt was never tried after the war. When Soviet troops approached Neustadt in April 1945, he received orders to evacuate the camp along with other medical officers. Before leaving, he destroyed as many experimental records as he could, burning personal notebooks, handwritten reports, photographs of procedures. The official documents archived in Berlin also burned during the chaos of the Reich's final days. He fled west, avoiding Soviet-controlled zones. He was captured by U.S. forces near Hamburg in June 1945, not as a war criminal, but simply as a low-ranking German prisoner of war. During routine interrogations, he denied any involvement in medical experiments. He claimed he had only been a camp physician treating common illnesses among prisoners: typhus, dysentery, malnutrition. He said he had never been assigned to experimental departments, that his work had been strictly therapeutic. There was not enough evidence to contradict him. The records were gone. The witnesses were scattered across Europe, many without identification, without documents, without any way to prove where they had been or what they had endured. Others were too traumatized to testify coherently before military tribunals. The case was closed for lack of evidence. Dr. Arendt was released in February 1947 after 22 months in POW camps. He returned to West Berlin. He legally changed his name to Wilhelm Arndt. One letter. A minimal alteration that slipped unnoticed through official paperwork. He resumed his career as a forensic pathologist at a private hospital in Charlottenburg. He worked there for 18 years. He was respected by colleagues. Between 1950 and 1965, he published 7 articles on forensic pathology in German medical journals. None mentioned his wartime work. None referred to Neustadt. He retired in 1965 with a full state pension. He died in 1971, at 74 years old, of a massive heart attack in his sleep, in his Berlin apartment. His obituary in the Berliner Morgenpost described him as a dedicated and respected physician who had served with distinction in difficult times and contributed significantly to the development of modern forensic medicine in Germany. He was never convicted. He never confessed. He never paid for what he did to 117 women in that wooden barrack soaked in the smell of disinfectant. Anna Feldman was liberated from Neustadt on April 30, 1945. 2 days before Berlin's official surrender, Soviet troops reached the camp and found about 3,500 prisoners still alive, out of more than 40,000 who had passed through it. Anna weighed 38 kilos. She was nearly blind from severe malnutrition. She was 20 years old by the calendar, but her body looked like that of a 50-year-old woman. She spent 6 months in a Red Cross hospital in Malmö, Sweden, recovering physically, though some wounds didn't close with food, rest, or time. For years, she didn't talk about what she had lived through. Not because she wanted to forget, but because words were completely inadequate. How do you explain to someone who was never there what it means to become a number? That a man with a university degree treated you like laboratory material and still gave you an instruction? Close your eyes. Don't scream. Not to save you, but to make his experiment more precise, more scientifically correct. How do you explain that obeying was the only way to preserve even a fragment of control over your own body, at the exact moment that body was being destroyed by someone who saw only a biological sample? In 1948, she emigrated to the United States, sponsored by a Jewish refugee aid organization. She settled in New York. She legally changed her name to Leah Morgan, a name that sounded less European, less marked. She worked as an accountant for a small textile company on the Lower East Side. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her family had sold fabrics in Breslau. Now she kept the books for a fabric business in Manhattan. She never married, never had children, not by choice. She lived alone in a one-room apartment in the Bronx for 40 years. She worked, paid taxes, voted, bought groceries, cooked, slept. From the outside, she lived a normal, functional, invisible life. Inside, something was still broken. Something without a name in English, or German, or Yiddish. A fracture that ran through everything and couldn't be seen from the outside. She lived 40 years in self-imposed silence. Until 1985, when an organization of Holocaust survivors, the USC Shoah Foundation, contacted her. They were collecting testimonies from women subjected to medical experiments in concentration camps. Her name had surfaced in partially reconstructed lists from Neustadt. Anna, Leah, agreed to speak, not to seek revenge against men who were likely already dead, not to obtain justice from a legal system that had let most of the perpetrators escape. She spoke so there would be a record, so that someone, somewhere, at some future moment, would know exactly what had happened in that wooden barrack with neatly arranged medical instruments and a doctor in white gloves who spoke of samples and protocols. Her testimony was recorded on video in January 1986 at the Foundation's offices in Manhattan. It lasted 17 minutes, the exact same length as the procedure, 43 years earlier. When she was asked how she had survived, not just physically, but mentally, She gave an answer the interviewer didn't expect. The doctor told me to close my eyes and not scream. He explained that if I screamed, my body would react in ways that would ruin his experiment. I obeyed not because I trusted him, and not because I believed he was helping me, but because I understood that screaming wouldn't change anything. It would only give him more control over my reaction. So I decided not to give him that satisfaction. I decided not to give him the data he was looking for. I closed my eyes. I didn't scream. And in that minimal gesture, in that very small decision, I found something like control. Not over what they were doing to me, but over how I faced it. She was asked whether she had ever forgiven Dr. Arendt. "You don't forgive someone who never repents," she said firmly, without hesitation. He never asked for forgiveness. He never even publicly acknowledged what he did. To him, I was never a person with a name, a history, a future. I was sample number 43 of Protocol B7, a data point in a 52-page report. And laboratory samples don't deserve apologies. They don't deserve recognition. They don't deserve memory. They asked her what she wanted people to understand. She said that those who did this were not crazed monsters. They were trained professionals, doctors with university degrees, scientists with published papers, men who signed reports and followed protocols. The horror, she said, wasn't born from madness. It came from logic applied without moral limits, from science stripped of humanity. And that, she said, was the truly terrifying part. Because monsters are easy to recognize. But men in white coats and rubber gloves, men who treat you as research material while calmly explaining the procedure, are much harder to identify until it's already too late. Leah Morgan died in New York on March 12, 1998, at the age of 75, from pneumonia complicated by respiratory failure. She was buried at Mount Hebron Jewish Cemetery in Queens. She left no immediate family, no children, no grandchildren. What she did leave behind was her testimony. Recorded on video, transcribed, archived, preserved at the University of Southern California and at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. 17 minutes of truth, set against decades of official silence. Miriam Keller survived. She returned to Poland after liberation, but her hometown of Lublin no longer existed as she remembered it. The ghetto had been erased. The hospital where she had worked lay in ruins. Her friends were dead. Her family had vanished into extermination camps. There was nothing left to return to, only rubble and memory. She worked as a nurse in a public hospital in Warsaw for 30 years. She never married. She never spoke publicly about Neustadt. When someone asked about the scars on her abdomen, she simply said, "The war," and changed the subject. She died in Warsaw in 1982 of stomach cancer. She was 71 years old. Eva Lorenz disappeared completely from official records in July 1943. Her name appears on transfer lists from Neustadt to Bergen-Belsen, dated July 23rd, but there is no confirmation that she arrived alive. Bergen-Belsen kept no detailed intake records during that period. The camp was overcrowded, disorganized, drowning in administrative chaos. She was 14 years old when she underwent the procedure in Neustadt. She was never located after the war. Her name is engraved on the memorial to child victims of the Holocaust in Krakow, alongside 1,236 other Jewish children and adolescents from the city who never returned. Gefreiter Paul Brandner was captured by Soviet forces in May 1945 near Potsdam. He spent 4 years in prisoner of war camps in Siberia. He testified briefly at the Nuremberg trials in 1947 as a minor witness, questioned about his role as a medical assistant in Neustadt. He admitted being present during experimental medical procedures, but denied active participation. He claimed he had only followed orders, that he didn't fully understand what was happening, that he was a young soldier without real medical training. He was released in 1949. He returned to his hometown in Bavaria and worked as a carpenter until his death in 1967 from liver cirrhosis. He was 48 years old. He never spoke publicly about his time in Neustadt. When his son, born in 1951, asked years later what he had done during the war, he answered, "Things not worth remembering." In total, more than 2,300 women were subjected to non-consensual medical experiments in Nazi concentration camps between 1942 and 1945. Fewer than 300 survived long enough to testify after the war. Most of the doctors responsible never faced justice. Of the 23 physicians charged at the Nuremberg doctors' trials of 1946 to 1947, only 7 were sentenced to death. 16 were acquitted or received lesser sentences. Many of them went on with their careers in hospitals, universities, private clinics, in West Germany, the United States, Argentina, and elsewhere. Some even published medical research based on data obtained in the camps, never once mentioning where that data had come from. Those articles still exist in scientific journals, and from time to time, they're cited in modern studies by researchers who have no idea of their true origin. The horror wasn't improvised. It was planned, budgeted, typed up in reports, authorized by signed orders, carried out by trained professionals, and afterward, it was systematically erased, or at least, there was an attempt. Documents were burned, names were changed, responsibility was denied, but the survivors didn't forget. And even though it took decades before anyone truly wanted to listen, before the world was ready to face an uncomfortable truth, they eventually spoke. Dr. Arendt's warning, "Close your eyes, don't scream," wasn't an act of hidden mercy. It wasn't a flash of suppressed humanity under pressure. It was a technical instruction, a way to control experimental variables, a method to improve data quality. But for Leah, that sentence became something else. It became a choice. The choice not to break visibly, not to give him the satisfaction of watching her collapse, to preserve, if only for a fleeting moment, something that resembled control over her own body. At the exact moment that body was being systematically destroyed, it wasn't heroism. It wasn't organized political resistance. It wasn't extraordinary bravery. It was silent resistance. The smallest, most desperate, most fragile form of human dignity. The decision not to scream when every part of your body demands that you scream. The decision to close your eyes when seeing might break you forever. And maybe that's the most terrible part of all. That in places where humanity was reduced to experiment, where bodies became numerical data and lives turned into archived statistics, where educated men applied scientific methodology to the systematic destruction of other human beings, the only way to preserve something resembling dignity was to obey the instruction of a torturer. Close your eyes. Don't scream. Because no one was coming to save you. Because screaming wouldn't change the outcome. The only victory possible was so small, so intimate, so invisible to anyone but her, that it barely deserved the name. But for Leah, it mattered. It mattered. Through 40 years of silence, through a life lived in the shadow of what had been taken from her, that decision, that obedience transformed into an act of will, was the only proof she had that she hadn't been completely destroyed. It didn't save her. It didn't repair the physical damage. It didn't bring justice or restore what was lost. but it gave her something no one else could take away. The certainty that, in the worst moment of her life, when she was most broken, most vulnerable, she had made a decision. And that decision, however small it was, had been hers.